Hello, everyone. I'm Yolanda Norris-Clark, and welcome back to Birth Balm. It has been a little while. It's been a long minute since I've done an official episode of Birth Balm, and my hope is that moving forward, I will be releasing a new episode every week. It's been, maybe a year-long hiatus, a couple of years, but here we are. It feels like the right time to come back and to reintroduce you to this podcast and to dive back into the conversations that matter most to me and that I hope are interesting to you as well. So, for those of you who are new here or who maybe need a refresher, this is indeed Birth Balm. And this is the podcast where I explore mothering, life, politics, pregnancy, wild pregnancy, spirituality, free birth, God, and of course, just birth in general. Birth as a lens, birth as a metaphor, birth as a literal, visceral, and symbolic transformation. Really, it's all birth. It's all birth and death in the end. So, yeah, this is the space where I'm going to be talking about relationships and parenting and my perspective on life and the world and what's happening around us, and all things against the grain through the prism of birth. And I'm so delighted to be back. There are so many topics that I'm thrilled to start to discuss with you here again. Now, a little personal update before we get into today's big and somewhat heavy topic. I am indeed currently pregnant with my 11th baby. That's right, baby number 11. And this will be the 9th child to be joining our immediate family. So I have 2 adult children, but my husband and I have almost 9 young kids together in our home. So for those who are obsessively keeping track or spreading bizarre rumors that the number changes all the time. I've heard that a lot lately. Or the newest bit of inane slander, which is apparently that I have never actually given birth at all. I've never been pregnant, and that I have perhaps purchased all of my children from a Bulgarian orphanage or some such thing. I have indeed, in fact, been pregnant 15 times. I've had 4 losses, and I have given birth with my own womb and genitals 10 times thus far. And the reason the number keeps changing is that I keep getting pregnant and having babies. However, if you are deeply preoccupied by my personal contribution, as you might see it, to overpopulation or repopulation, depending on your perspective, then rest assured, because all good things do come to an end. And I suspect that sometime in the next few years, God will decree that my time of intensive mothering is complete, and I will maybe even get to become a grandmother someday. Anyway, stay tuned for all of that, but I just had to mention it because I do get a surprising number of questions about the logistics of my family and lots of bizarre skepticism about the so-called narrative. But again, the simple version is that I have almost 11 children and that my husband and I together have almost 9 children. And so, mystery solved, hopefully. So today I'm going to tackle a topic that is very prominent in the public conversation. This is not something that I had planned to discuss, but before we get into that, let me quickly mention that if you'd like to follow me on social media, my Instagram handle is at Bauhauswife, which is BAUHAUSWIFE, and my website is yolandanorris-clark.com, Yolanda with an E at the end. And there you can find all of my various offerings, including courses and programs on pregnancy and birth and wellness. And I'll be sharing more about all of that later and in the coming episodes. But for now, let's dive in to this very harrowing and very sad topic that is top of mind for a lot of people these days. So a couple of days ago, on September 10th, Lee mentioned to me, we were in the kitchen just preparing lunch, I think. Lee mentioned to me that he just found out that Charlie Kirk had been shot during a public speaking engagement at the University of Utah, I think it was. And I had no idea who Charlie Kirk was. I really didn't have the faintest clue. I've been pretty much apolitical for most of my life. Politics have never really been my thing. And even during that brief period when I dabbled in what might be described as political or social commentary back in the days of Rona, I wasn't really discussing politics per se. It was more cultural critique or philosophical musings. But politics have never really been my scene. If pressed, if I was asked to label myself, and I really don't like labels, I'd say I lean libertarian, maybe even anarcho-libertarian if we're getting specific. But again, I don't love categorizing myself, and I don't actually think that these labels really matter very much anymore. I think most of these descriptors have really been largely denatured, if they ever had any real meaning, though I'm very aware that I would clearly be described by others, by many others, as a far-right Christian conservative, which is totally fine by me. Because what I do believe in above all else is personal responsibility and obedience to God. That really is the foundation for me. And ultimately, my goal, my intention is to live in obedience to God. I fail all the time, but at the end of the day, I think the real battle isn't by any stretch left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. It's really between the people of God and powers and principalities. That's where the real struggle resides. So I don't consider myself left or right. I mean, as we all know, two wings of the same bird, it's up in flames. So I don't really follow politics in the traditional sense. And I don't actually have much to do with social media, believe it or not, except for the fact that I run my business there and I show up there every day to run my business. But my real life is very much lived outside of that. That said, I do have an interest in the world and in the way that perception and public conversations and collective belief shape the world in many ways, shape ideology, shape perception. And I've certainly dipped in and out of listening to people like Tucker Carlson, who's a highly skilled interviewer and who can be quite compelling at times. I also occasionally listen to Dave Smith, who I don't even think identifies as a libertarian anymore necessarily, but he's someone whose opinions I've often found myself agreeing with, more often than not. And Candace Owens is just irresistible and outrageous and totally charming. I think she's great, very funny. And no matter how many lobster dinners with the vice president or gigs in Dubai he sells out for, I am an unabashed fan of Tim Dillon. So, I kind of dabble in all sorts of various places from time to time. Mostly I'm listening to podcasts when I work out. I also listen to some very alternative, very kind of underground people who I don't even necessarily want to mention here, but maybe I'll talk about them later in other places. So given all of that, I'm also very aware that there is a certain contingent of people who suggest that all of the aforementioned speakers, influencers, pundits are controlled opposition, paid shills, state props. And of course, I think that should at this point be fairly self-evident, because really anyone who is platformed to any extent by the mainstream media, and all of those people undoubtedly are, serve some kind of purpose. They may seem as though they're fighting the man or resisting tyranny or speaking out against this or that. And that might actually be their personal intention and their belief quite sincerely. But if they were really doing any of that, if they were in fact any kind of real threat to the status quo, they would not be around. If any of those people got too close to the sun, they would go the way of poor Charlie Kirk. I think that's, again, self-evident. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But yeah, we live in this world where everything is controlled, everything is surveilled. The powers that shouldn't be, the powers that were, the powers that are on their way out are still wielding quite a lot of influence, let's say. So I didn't know who Charlie Kirk was, but I became immediately aware of his assassination when it happened, because as I said, Lee brought it to my attention. And in the past day or two since his murder, I've come across a number of his quotes, clips from his public debates and interviews, and bits and pieces of his work in a variety of ways. And I found myself truly moved. Because, of course, the killing of anyone in cold blood is tragic, but also because in every single clip of Kirk's that I've encountered, in every piece of footage, He is measured and dignified and very, very respectful, even in response to the most unhinged, deranged, and just frankly stupid opponents. Like enragingly stupid at times. And so far, I've encountered very few opinions of his that I really disagree with. Now, anyone who's been following me for a while now will know that over the past decade, many of my own views have shifted and evolved, in some cases seemingly quite dramatically, although it's been quite a steady evolution. And I've talked about this in various places, but for a long time, years actually, I considered myself to be a feminist. Or, well, maybe not so much considered myself to be a feminist, but I supported the feminist political movement. I truly believed that women were being systematically oppressed by men and that we had an obligation to fight for women's liberation from male dominance. I never really thought of feminism as an identity. I've never really been one for identity politics. I'm always just me. But for a significant chunk of my life, for a significant period during my life, my early life, I did see myself aligned with feminist ideas and ideals. And yet over the past 10 years, I've been in this process of disentangling myself from that ideological framework. And I would now, at this point, describe myself as an ex-feminist, maybe even an anti-feminist, honestly. And I've come to see feminism as a deeply destructive, victim-oriented ideology and cult, even. I absolutely think that feminism undermines women's standing in society. I think it damages relationships, it damages family bonds, and the dynamics that hold families together. And honestly, I think it's quite detrimental to everyone involved, men, women, children, society as a whole. And I do think that a healthy society, healthy community, a healthy family structure, every iteration of human connections requires a biblical patriarchy to function optimally. And that biblical patriarchy mirrors biology. Men are physically bigger and stronger than women, and women require the protection and the provision of men. And I believe that given the inevitable realities of biology, men are in fact designed by God and by nature, they're one and the same, to lead, to attend to external structures, and to provide the framework for a functional organism, social organism. And this doesn't mean by any stretch that women are less worthy or less powerful in our own right or less important, but we are not equal to men, not at all. We do, however, complement each other, men and women, and we do possess gifts and competencies and a purpose, each to their own, that the other does not. And when I think back to the years that I resisted this self-evident reality and railed against it, I can't help but think about how pitiful and ridiculous and inverted all of that was, which, of course, again, is part of the entire purpose of feminism. Feminism is an expression of the satanic inversion of nature and biology and God. Anyway, since becoming Orthodox Christian catechumens, myself and my husband and our children almost 2 years ago, Lee and I and our kids have been on quite the journey of rectifying the rightful order of our family and quite sincerely reinstating the patriarchy in our home, which has been a really beautiful experience, but also a challenging one, primarily because obedience and grace and softness are very challenging states of being for me to access. Yet I'm also very aware that it is absolutely possible to be obedient and graceful and soft while also being exactly who I am. And that in fact, coming into the fullness of who I am and what I'm capable of really does depend on assuming and summoning all of what femininity really is and treating my husband and my role as a mother and a wife with the reverence and sanctity that these vocations deserve, really. So when I heard that a man like Charlie Kirk was killed, and when I witnessed him presenting his opinions, which are overwhelmingly biblical and God-centered and, yes, conservative, but primarily Christian, I agree with almost everything he seems to have to say for the most part. I certainly haven't myself come across or seen or heard anything from him that strikes me as in any way racist or bigoted whatsoever. I completely agree with his stance on gender ideology, for example, and on the place of women and men in their respective roles in the family and in society. And he just seems like a very reasonable, very thoughtful person. And this was all the more striking to me in contrast to the memes that I've been seeing now passed around by those who despised Charlie Kirk. So these are memes with short quotes of his most supposedly egregious sentiments, like the idea that empathy is a made-up New Age term that does a lot of damage. I'm paraphrasing, but when I read this little mini quote, my initial thought was that I don't actually agree with that wholesale, but I do see that the concept of empathy and that the word itself has been largely weaponized by the left, and that it's used in many cases to justify a kind of perpetual cyclical victimhood. But when I delved a little bit deeper, it turns out that this snippet about empathy, like most of the other quotes that have been shared around in these negative memes, was actually taken out of context, and that Kirk went on to say about empathy that he actually prefers the concept of sympathy to that of empathy because empathy is far more grounded and truthful and involves an acknowledgement of the other person's pain without the pretense of actually being able to understand exactly what they're going through, and that his issue with empathy is that it connotes this idea that you can somehow inhabit another person's emotional experience when you can't. You just can't. And actually, I agree with that entirely. And that the added context really, I mean, it doesn't completely change the meaning of what he was saying, but it does offer just so much more richness to this idea that I do entirely agree with. So many of his quotes, like the one I just gave an example of, are being isolated in these kind of hit list compilations of all of the supposedly terrible things that Kirk has ever said. But when you actually dig into it, you realize that these are just sound bites that have been surgically extracted and framed in the worst possible light. But let's set aside the question of whether or not you or I personally agree with Kirk's views on any given subject. What has really struck me the most is, again, how he comes across as a person. In every clip I've seen, in every debate, in every interview, Kirk is polite and courteous and respectful, even when he's engaging with people who clearly don't share his views, to say the least. He really just seems like a genuinely decent human being, and I've been quite impressed by that, as I said. And I suppose this is partly why his assassination has struck me as so profoundly sad. I mean, obviously, any murder is tragic. It's an understatement. But the way that he was killed was just so shocking and so horrifying. And the fact of his killing is clearly, undeniably political and performative, whatever the true rationale might be behind taking him out. More than anything, the fact that he leaves behind a devoted wife and two beautiful children, young children. I mean, not that that really matters, but it's so terrible. What's even more horrifying in some ways is the reaction from those who would undoubtedly describe themselves as being on the left. People who think of themselves as progressives and humanitarians even. The way that I've witnessed certain people, many people within that, let's just call it left demographic, the way that these people are characterizing Kirk's death just with a stunning degree of smug self-righteousness and an almost just a sense of glee and delight it's truly repulsive. And it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for them. It's embarrassing for anyone who considers themselves to be human. It's embarrassing to anyone who's indulging in that kind of rhetoric. It should be embarrassing. To celebrate someone's death, to revel in it, it's not just morally bankrupt, it's just such an ugly reflection of where we are as a society. And maybe that's always been the case. Maybe this kind of self-righteous smugness and cruelty is normal. But I think it's something that we should be ashamed of collectively, and it's something we should call out And so I'm going to give an example. I'm connected via social media with an individual that I've known loosely for quite a long time. This is an acquaintance, really. We're not at all close, but I do know her as a real person. This is someone that I initially connected with in real life, face to face, over 20 years ago. This person is Canadian, and this is someone who, let's just say, checks all of the predictable woke boxes. She was pro-mask, pro-lockdown. She's probably someone, I mean, I'm making this up, but I'm sure it's true. She's probably someone who went on and on about long COVID, just all of the usual liberal stances. She's pro-immigration, endlessly wringing her hands over imagined racism, Black Lives Matter, privilege, the whole litany of progressive talking points. And now I won't identify her, of course. I am not ever in the business of publicly humiliating individuals, only ideological stances. But this person posted the following, quote, "I'm just learning that Charlie Kirk has passed away. Yet another tragic situation of gun violence." Would we really characterize his assassination as gun violence? I mean, of course, he was killed by a gun, but it was a hit. This was an assassination. Anyway, she goes on, "I feel deeply sorry for his family and friends. Whether we agree on things or not, he's still a person made in the image of God and has sacred life." Okay, it's a very nice, very kind sentiment. No problems there. But she continues, quote, "It's no secret Charlie Kirk advocated loudly for gun rights." Here's a direct quote. So she's quoting Kirk now. "I think the cost is worth it, unfortunately, of some gun deaths every single year so we can have our Second Amendment and protect our other God-given rights." So this is a quote of Kirk's that's floating around. People are really kind of focused on this. And then this woman, this progressive woman, adds at the very end, "He, Charlie Kirk, suffered the consequences of his own advocacy." And that really made me stop short. It really struck me as just such a repulsive thing to say or to write. He suffered the consequences of his own advocacy. So this woman actually thinks that there's some kind of equivalency between Charlie Kirk's support for gun rights, the Second Amendment, and the fact that he was shot in cold blood at a public venue. I mean, this is so beyond the pale, and it's truly, truly shocking to me. The consequences of his own advocacy. So let's be clear. The fact that there are deranged individuals in the world who will go to great lengths to murder politicians or to hire hitmen, for that matter, has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Charlie Kirk's stance on gun rights. Absolutely nothing. There's no connection there. Now, as I said, I didn't know anything about Kirk until this incident, but I would bet anything that Charlie Kirk never, not once, advocated for the random violent murder of politicians or pundits or anyone else for that matter. That's not what gun rights advocacy is about. That's not what freedom or libertarian advocacy is about. Tearing during the birth process is one of the biggest fears that new mothers have about birth in general, and for very good reason. A severe perineal tear can cause immense pain and discomfort postpartum, and it can also affect our body image, our sense of self, and our intimate relationship. And yet so much of the advice that you'll find out there about preventing tearing during birth is not only ineffective, but often downright counterproductive. There is, however, a formula for optimizing your chances of not tearing during birth, and I've created a full program based on my 24 years of experience, including the births of my own 10 babies, to support mothers in experiencing a birth that is truly easeful and that you can emerge from intact and integral. For more information on Integral, the full program, visit my website at yolandanorris-clark.com or check the show notes below for the link. Murder is not equivalent to supporting the Second Amendment, whatever it is that you happen to think about guns or gun rights or gun violence. These are two entirely different conversations, and conflating them is not just intellectually lazy, it's, especially in this context, totally morally repugnant. It's a way of instrumentalizing a terrible tragedy for the sake of political expedience. Now, I actually despise guns. I always have. I don't want to be around guns. I find them intimidating. I find them very unsettling. My own father was actually a staunch advocate for gun rights and hunting rights. He was a hunter, so I grew up around guns, and I want nothing to do with them. Now, that's just me personally. I don't really think or talk about gun rights in general. It's not really a topic that is terribly interesting to me. Uh, but I do care deeply about individual freedoms and the broader issues of government overreach. So I actually, I do think that people have a right to bear arms. I value rights and freedoms in general, even if guns are not my thing at all. I have no interest in having anything to do with guns. But I can also see why it is that so many people, especially in the past 5 years, have shifted their stance on gun ownership and gun rights, especially since in places like Canada, which is where I'm from, there's been such a recent encroachment on gun ownership. And given what's going on in Canada and really all over the world, I totally understand why people are becoming more and more insistent on the importance of gun rights. But none of that is actually the point here. The point is this. The comment my acquaintance made about Charlie Kirk and the outcome of his advocacy is so mean-spirited and so dumb and so completely misses the mark that I have to unpack it. The idea that tighter gun legislation, more restrictions, fewer rights, whatever, is going to have any impact whatsoever on people acquiring guns illegally or being hired by three-letter agencies to commit heinous acts of violence it's delusional. It's a fantasy. It's one of the more absurd liberal pipe dreams, though certainly not the most absurd. But what's worse is that this comment that Kirk suffered the consequences of his own advocacy, it's not just misguided, it's cruel. It is essentially blaming Charlie Kirk for his murder. And that's just atrocious. It's ludicrous. And I see this kind of attitude over and over and over again from self-described liberals. This smugness and gloating, the sort of I told you so mentality. It's deeply hypocritical, it's self-righteous, and it's directed quite aggressively, it seems, at almost anyone who dares to hold a different political opinion. And again, it's embarrassing. It's almost as though these people can't really, like, they have no self-awareness. There's no self-awareness. There's a complete lack of any seeming capacity to sort of witness themselves. So in the wake of this encounter with this friend's status on social media, I wrote a short piece that I published on Instagram and Substack, and I'm going to read it out. Charlie Kirk suffered the consequences of his own advocacy. So, of course, I'm quoting my progressive acquaintance here. And as I've said, this is a sentiment that I've seen repeated numerous times by those on the left. Charlie Kirk suffered the consequences of his own advocacy. Excuse me. Well, he said outright that a certain number of gun deaths was worth the cost of the Second Amendment. Right, he did say that. And how does that equate in any way to advocating for cold-blooded murder? How exactly is being assassinated any kind of consequence at all of standing for the right of responsible citizens to bear arms? Is the person who advocates for the freedom to drive a car somehow at fault or suffering the consequences of their own advocacy if they die in a head-on collision? Is the person who advocates for the freedom to ride a horse somehow at fault or suffering the consequences of their own advocacy if they're thrown from the saddle and trampled to death? Is the woman who advocates for the freedom of all mothers to give birth where, how, and with whom she chooses somehow at fault if her baby dies in the context of choosing home birth? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. It turns out that a lot of people do indeed think that she is responsible and culpable. Whatever you happen to believe about guns or gun rights or Charlie Kirk himself or natural childbirth for that matter, The suggestion that Kirk got what was coming to him, which I've now seen repeated like a zombie mantra by countless smug, sanctimonious, self-described liberals who genuinely consider themselves superior to conservative Christians like Kirk, betrays a profoundly insidious brand of hatred that is far uglier and goes far, far beyond anything Kirk had the courage to say up front and out loud. Furthermore, the idea that gun legislation will ever put a stop to crazy people harming others, or governments hiring hitmen, or intelligence agencies going to work is totally delusional and has nothing whatsoever to do with individual rights and freedoms. Was Kirk a crisis actor? Was he a puppet? Was he a sacrifice? Probably. Maybe. Also not the point. The most radical act is love. Do not succumb to the temptation to hate. Lord have mercy. Now, somewhat to my surprise, this post garnered an enormous response on social media. I'm surprised because I'm always surprised by the collective dumbness and the collective commitment to victimhood and the willingness of those who see themselves as especially caring and especially virtuous and especially anti-hate and love is love to be delusional and despicable. Never ceases to amaze, never ceases to shock me. But it's not just the left. Of course, this kind of reflexive rage occurs in all directions. I'm not exempt from it, obviously. And among the first wave of comments to this post that I made on Instagram came from someone who didn't scroll past that first slide, the slide that reads, "Kirk suffered the consequences of his advocacy." And this individual lashed out with the following. She wrote, "You are a vile human being," speaking to me. "You are a vile human being. He advocated for gun rights, not the right to be murdered in cold blood for voicing an opinion. You should know better, but most of all, you and your family should be ashamed." And I thought this was very interesting because this person actually agrees with me. She agrees with my fundamental point. But she didn't take the time to actually read the post. And as a result, she's calling me a vile human being. Now, there is a massive distinction between telling someone that their position, their opinion, or their sentiments, or their words even, are vile. And I actually think that's perfectly acceptable. It's perfectly acceptable to say to someone, what you just said is vile. It's not pleasant to hear from another person that they believe that your perspectives are vile, but that's still very, very different than telling another person that they are a vile human being. In fact, being told that I'm a vile human being by someone who simply misinterpreted my position is a perfect encapsulation of the very thing that I was critiquing in my post. This knee-jerk, sanctimonious outrage that masquerades as moral superiority, but is really just hatred. That said, I see far more of this reactionary loathing from people who hated Kirk, and I mean really, really hated him, despite, again, not knowing him at all. I see so much more of this reactionary hatred on the left than I do on the right. And apparently, according to some people on the left, he was a racist and a bigot and a transphobe, and his words did violence. And this is what people are saying. This is what a lot of people are saying, that his words did violence. Now, I think that is an absurdity unto itself. And this, in many ways, is at the very crux of the comments and objections to my post on the part of those who actually do disagree with my fundamental premise and my overall point, which really is that, and this is, I think, Kirk's point also, the foundation of any justice in a society or a culture always begins with free and open speech and unrestricted dialogue and an appreciation for choice and free will. In fact, unequivocal free speech, in my view, is a primary form of protection against actual violence. Now, one silly person wrote in to say that, quote, "Charlie was careless with his words and his direction." I mean, that doesn't really even mean anything, but the idea that he was careless with his words really seems to not be the case at all. everything that I've gleaned from everything that I've encountered of his seems to indicate that Kirk built a career on being quite precise and very deliberate with his words. And of course, you don't have to like what he had to say, but to call him careless really seems factually incorrect. Now, this person goes on to say, quote, he used dangerous rhetoric that caused unmeasurable harm to certain groups of people. Now, this again is just, it's ludicrous. Unmeasurable harm? What does that even mean? Unmeasurable harm. First of all, how convenient that all the purported harm Kirk's words did is unmeasurable. First of all, how convenient that all the purported harm that Kirk's words did is somehow unmeasurable, and that this was harm that only certain groups of people incurred. I mean, what groups? And where is the evidence of this so-called harm? There isn't any, obviously. And the fact is, words are not violence. Words are the antithesis of violence. If you're a mother, if you're thinking of becoming pregnant, or if you're simply a human being curious about the nature of our origins, our purpose, and our connection to God, I want to warmly encourage you to check out my Amazon bestselling book, Portal: The Art of Choosing Orgasmic, Pain-Free, Blissful Birth. Part memoir and a chronicle of my experience of giving birth to my first 9 children, part guidebook for women who are curious about exploring the possibility of pain-free, blissful birth, which is absolutely possible for every one of us, and partly a capacious, philosophical, poetic exploration of the power we've been granted by God to choose every thought, response, and reaction, which in turn orchestrates the shape of our lives. Portal is my love letter to humanity. It's the culmination of my 20 years of work as a birth consultant and birth witness, and of course, of my own experience as a mother to now almost 11 children. And Portal is available now on Amazon.com. And if you happen to be among the thousands of people who have read the book and loved it, I would be so very grateful for your glowing 5-star review. Words can certainly be confronting and provocative and offensive even. Words can be emotionally hurtful if you choose to grant them power, but that is entirely one's own prerogative. And what those people who are making this claim are essentially saying, and in many cases saying totally blatantly, is that they believe that speech should be regulated, and that they believe that Charlie Kirk's speech in particular inflicted the kind of harm that can on some level be equated to the harm that in the end came to him, his slaying. And this is really, among other things, this is a call to the very kind of censorship and authoritarianism and erosion of freedoms that people like Kirk were trying to defend. And Kirk was a provocateur. He was a debater. He was a pundit. He was a guy whose job it was to argue controversial points with precision and conviction, and he clearly did a good job at that. Again, you don't have to like him or agree with him, but to suggest that his words were dangerous or that they caused unmeasurable harm it's just delusional. And it's also, I mean, I feel a real sense of solidarity in this with the late Charlie Kirk, because this is the kind of feedback that I get from drooling, victimized liberals all the time. You know, that I'm spreading misinformation, that my opinions are harmful and dangerous, and that what I have to say about birth and life and health and death is I'm a danger to society. And it's just so utterly pathetic and ridiculous and delusional. Now, speaking of delusions, I also want to address this idea that gun legislation will somehow put an end to gun violence. This also is a complete fantasy. Why? Because guns already exist. We can't unexist guns. We can't put that particular genie back in the bottle. The bad guys will always find a way to get guns or knives or bombs or machetes or whatever else they can use to harm people. The idea that we can legislate our way to a violence-free utopia is not just naive, it's actually a dangerous dangerous distraction from the real issues at play. I mean, is it really a dangerous distraction? It's an argument, so I guess no, it's not technically dangerous given my previous argument, but it's ridiculous and it's delusional. Yet I've encountered numerous objections to my analogy between the inevitable harm caused by our freedom to drive cars or to ride horses and the inevitable harm that will be caused simply by the existence of guns in the world. And the pushback that I keep hearing is that the difference here is that cars aren't designed to cause harm, but guns are. But I don't understand why that would be relevant. Like, yeah, I mean, that's true, yes. Guns are designed to be weapons. They are weapons. I don't think anyone's disputing that. The fact remains that millions of people die in vehicle accidents every year that could absolutely be prevented if we removed cars from the world entirely, which isn't going to happen. And also, yes, if we magically removed all guns from the face of the planet, then no one would die from gun violence. Yes, that's true, which is also not going to happen. I mean, I don't, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You don't have to be a genius to figure that one out. They're not going anywhere. And they're not going anywhere because weapons exist, including guns. And not only do they simply exist, they're part of the larger story of human civilization. Humans have only been able to thrive and to excel and to build the world we know today because of our ability to secure food and to defend ourselves. And weapons have been absolutely intrinsic to both of those pursuits. From the very beginning of humanity, conflict has been a part of human existence, and weapons have evolved alongside us as tools to navigate that reality. So yes, guns are designed to cause harm. That is the point, yes. But they're also part of a broader historical context that is deeply woven into the fabric of human survival and progress. And most significantly, they're not going anywhere. And this idea that we can somehow separate ourselves from that reality in which guns, for better or worse, do exist, that we could just wish away the existence of weapons or the harm that they might cause, or legislate away the harm that weapons can cause, it just has no grounding in the real world. It's a total inanity that ignores the complexity of the human story. And in the end, as I pointed out in my Substack post, there is also, main point, no relationship whatsoever between gun restrictions and Charlie Kirk's assassination. More gun control over regular, everyday, responsible citizens would have had no impact whatsoever on Kirk's killing. Now, I know absolutely nothing about the back-end motivations for why Charlie Kirk was taken out. I've encountered a number of different theories, as we all have, I'm sure, at this point, some more compelling than others, each connected to a particular political position or narrative. And as a clueless mother, housewife, writer, philosopher, I can't pretend to have any insight whatsoever. I really don't. So if you happen to be among those who were either offended, deeply offended, on behalf of Kirk by my suggestion that maybe he was a puppet or a crisis actor, please understand that I am not actually making any such claim, nor am I making a claim that he was assassinated by any specific intelligence agency or group, because I have no clue. But what I am saying is that any number of those scenarios is possible, and that nobody knows anything. Just no one knows anything. Other than the people who know, no one knows. And to the handful of individuals who took the time to reach out to tell me how disgusting I am for, quote, saying nothing about the genocide of Palestinians while suddenly being moved to talk about a right-winger's murder, which is what one person so charmingly wrote, or lambasting me for, quote, defending a known white supremacist, but refusing to speak about Gaza, or the woman who a few weeks ago, who ordered me in no uncertain terms, in response to a topic that had nothing whatsoever to do with politics at all, to, quote, advocate for the children of Gaza. All I can really say to that is that I'm not your puppet, and I'm not ever going to accommodate specific requests to handle certain topics, especially not with this particular kind of aggressive energy. I have spent my entire adult life advocating loudly for the children of the world and for the importance of peaceful birth and breastfeeding and bodily integrity and medical freedom and the right to keep our immune systems intact and connected, loving families and optimal nourishment and health and healing. And I have spent my life directly serving my community, often for free, often in the face of intimidation and villainization, and often, in the past anyway, to the detriment, I'm ashamed to say, of my own children. And I think it goes without saying, or it should, that any normal person with even a modicum of compassion, which I do have, decries war and abuse and neglect and the starving of babies. And in fact, I currently, right now, at this moment, live in a country where children are routinely poisoned and mistreated and malnourished, like right next door to me. And this is the case in many, many places on Earth. And a significant portion of the money that I make goes towards supporting the disadvantaged in my community. And I know that I don't have anything to prove to anyone, but the irony of being lectured to by complete strangers is, it's profound. I don't have anything to say about Gaza specifically because I don't know anything about what's going on there. I've never been there. And I find it quite offensive to be ordered to make statements and proclamations about any topic at all, especially one that I really don't have a developed opinion on outside of stating the obvious, which is that war is bad. But by all means, if you have specific thoughts and opinions about Gaza, then you should definitely make a podcast about it, or an interpretive dance about it, or start a nonprofit foundation. I don't really think, however, that the people who are writing in to attempt to shame me into addressing Gaza are actually functioning under the impression, in any real sort of way, that hearing from me about Palestine is actually going to do anything to turn the tide. I think it's pretty clear that this is yet another example of woke progressive virtue signaling and bullying. And I'm not going to be bullied by you or anyone else. That said, I will leave you with the following quote. Charlie Kirk was murdered for speaking the truth and defending freedom. A lion-hearted friend of Israel, he fought the lies and stood tall for Judeo-Christian civilization. I spoke to him only 2 weeks ago and invited him to Israel. Sadly, that visit will not take place. We lost an incredible human being. His boundless pride in America and his valiant belief in free speech will leave a lasting impact. Rest in peace, Charlie Kirk. Can you guess who that was? That was supposedly posted by Benjamin Netanyahu himself. And I think we all have to make of that what we will. Very interesting though, isn't it? Very, very interesting, I thought. All right, that's all for today. I know it's a bit of a strange and unfortunate topic to be bringing to the revival of Birth Bomb, but there we have it. This is what's going on in the world right now. And in subsequent episodes, I'm going to be probably focusing a lot more on my own life and my thoughts and feelings about my pregnancy and my family and just the logistics of every day. But I had to talk about this because it entered my field, as these things sometimes do. All right, thanks for listening, everyone, and I hope to see you, hear you, talk to you next time.